My name is Joel Migdal, and I'm a member of the Jewish Studies program, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here and to welcome our lecturer, Yael Zerubavel. Tonight's lecture will demonstrate a different symbolic bridge to the past. Here, instead of reconstructing the past using modern meaning, Israel deconstructed the past, burnt its bridges, if you will, in distancing Israeli society from its immediate history, the experience of Galut, or Jewish exile, and of the Jewish diaspora communities. Professor Zerubavel.
Thank you very much. I want to say a couple things before I start with the second lecture. First, I want to thank Althea Stroum again for your wonderful gift of these lectures, which are really known all over. And it's not only all over the States, it's all over the world. I mean, it really has a terrific reputation. And it is a wonderful, wonderful gift to us, the scholars, not only to come here to deliver the lectures, but also to be able to read afterwards these works. And I actually have to thank Paul Burstyn for reminding me something that I had written to him when he invited me, and I should have mentioned it in the first lecture, and for some reason it slipped my mind. That when I was invited and I was accepting, and I thought what I want to do, I thought that there is a wonderful book that came out of this lecture series, which is Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi's book, Zachor. And this is a book in memory studies, and as you can already know, I am really into memory studies. And so I thought, well, it's the same series. I had really played with the idea that I would like to write something broader about Israeli memory, and what would fit better this forum if not to follow the model that Yerushalmi set and to do the same thing that he did about Jewish memory to do about Israeli memory. So if you look at the structure of my talk, antiquity, Galut or exile, Jewish exile, and the modern Israel, you can see the influence of looking at the relationship between history and memory that Yerushalmi set in his book. And what I would like to emphasize again, it really came out I said it in the beginning, and it came out up again when someone asked me a question. The level that I'm talking about is not the level of history, but the level of memory. That is to say, I'm not doing research about what happened in antiquity, what happened during Jewish exile, or what happened in the last part that really gets closest to us, and this is the history of the Israeli society during the pre-state years, the Yishuv years, and the early years of the state. How the memory of that period has become entrenched in Israeli memory. So in each of these lectures, what I'm doing, I'm first giving you as a context, the perception of, or the memory of the period I'm dealing with. This time it would be the Jewish exile, Galut. During the pre-state years, and although the state was founded in 48, and that's definitely a enormous landmark historiographically, in terms of memory, actually the 50s and the early 60s continue the period of the pre-state because it's still a very nationalistic commemorative culture. And the transition, you will see, is really coming at the late 60s and the 70s. So I will start with the part that deals with the context, and then I will move on to talk about the changes in Israeli memory of exile. So the very premise of the attitude, the Israeli attitude towards exile, is actually stemming from the Zionist memory. That is to say, it started prior to the Zionist immigration. It's actually the incentive to come to Palestine. And that comes from the Zionist drive to create a new era or to establish a new course in Jewish history. And the premise of that attitude is what is called in the language of the time the negation or the repudiation of exile. It's a very negative portrayal of that period that looks at the 18th centuries of Jewish life in exile as a single period. That's something that, when you know about Jewish memory, you kind of take you take as a given, because that's really the Zionist memory, just really continued the Jewish memory in terms of looking at exile as a relatively negative period relative to being in the land. This was a divine punishment. But what is important for us to remember that since we are not talking about the history, about the level of memory, that what we have here is a very homogenized view of a huge period extending over 18 centuries that refers to communities that lived in very different places, in very different conditions, and with very different cultures. But what is important is that from the perspective of Zionist memory, with the emphasis on the creation of a new society with a new national culture, that is beyond the point. The diversity of that experience is beyond the point. The emphasis is that Zionism is coming in order to enter Jewish history, to open a new phase, and to create a new society. And within this context, exile is perceived largely as a negative ideological model. That is to say, the new society has to become the other, different from the exilic society. Now, what we see here, and I will just talk about it in general terms because that provides us the context, is that the ideological positions or the rhetoric is very often includes references that are really anti-religious, and sometimes also even with some overt anti-Semitism or influenced by anti-Semitic views of the kind of the character, the general character of the exilic Jew, the Yehudi Galuti, very negative, very much what the new Jew should not be. And part of the achievement of the new Jewish society, the way that it measures itself against the vision, is how far have we come along from that negative stereotype of the exilic Jewish society. But we have to distinguish between these ideological postulations that very often are much more bold or extreme, radical, than what actually happens in the ground. And that we will see as we will go, we will see that this kind of gap between the statements and what is actually happening is always there. So for example, this very negative repudiation of exile, Jewish exile, that is so much part and parcel of Zionist memory, actually when you look at the construction of national Israeli culture, you see continuity from tradition. You see actually that there is a lot more than just negation of exile, and that in fact the Zionist pioneers themselves were, after all, the product of the exilic Jewish society. They had their relatives abroad, with whom they continued to have ties. The Yishuv as a whole, the whole Jewish society of Palestine, was connected to exilic communities organizationally, financially, politically. So these kind of extreme statements are really mitigated by a much more ambivalent approach when we look at what is happening on the ground. But the idea was to create a new society, and we already talked about it, and that's definitely not news to you. You know, the idea of the revival of Hebrew, but what is important is then the other side. It's not only that Hebrew has to be revived and to become the common language, it's also that Yiddish, the language that most of the Zionist pioneers came from Eastern Europe, and there were Yiddish speakers, that was the revolt against the Yiddish. And the Yiddish really had a very bad image, again, in terms of the statement. Now, there was a social sanction, or there was a drive to speak Hebrew. And in Tel Aviv, in the very early decades of Tel Aviv, in the 20s, there was actually a legion for the protection of Hebrew language that was roaming the streets and actually beating up Jews who were speaking Yiddish. Now, that's a rather short history and rather extreme. This is not typical of that, but the kind of disapproval of speaking Yiddish or Arabic or Ladino or any other language was still very much part of the public space. What is interesting is the distinction between the public space and the private space. Because in privacy, even those people who spoke Hebrew fluently, when they wanted to talk with their friends and their relatives, they switched to their native tongues. And so the famous national poet, Chaim Nachman Bialik, who got all this admiration for being the national poet of Israel, actually loved chatting in Yiddish and was even scolded, for talking in Yiddish with his friends. I remember my own grandparents. They came in the early 20s, spoke committed Zionists, spoke Hebrew very well, but when they talked among themselves, they spoke in Russian. And my grandmother spoke in French to her sister because both of them studied in French schools. And my other grandmother came from the United States prior to World War I, and from the United States, so she was speaking American English was her native tongue, and until she died, when she spoke to her siblings, it was in English. So this kind of duality has always been there. But to give you just another personal story to show you this dilemma, I remember in the 50s and the 60s, we had neighbors next door who the grandparents were living with them, and the kids were talking Yiddish with their grandparents. And my Sabra mother was very, really disapproved of that. Why do they speak Yiddish? So it was okay for the generation, the older generation, but for the kids, somehow it wasn't okay. But that's already a Sabra, because I think where you see it is in the shift between the second generation to the third generation that the immigrant language disappears. So there is no question that the Zionist pioneers themselves, who were the founders of the Hebrew culture, put pressure on themselves to relinquish their traditions, to move on, to create a new culture and a new society. They, of course, were not as much over the exilic culture as they wished to, but they really strove and they really put tremendous effort in that. The problem becomes when the people who came out with this commitment and this kind of almost fanaticism about doing it kind of expected others who didn't necessarily share the same views and values to act the same. And so when the German Jewish immigration came to Israel in the 30s, when the Middle Eastern Jews came after the foundation of the state, the same kind of tremendous pressure that they should forget their languages, they forget their ethnic traditions, move on and accept the secular national Hebrew culture was very much part of what was expected of them. What we see is after 48, as I said, the 50s and the 60s still continue this approach, but there is something starts to change because once the State of Israel is founded in 1948, you can't really call the diaspora exactly in the same name. So even though people talked about it and the history books refer to the period of exile prior to 48 as galut, and for the Jewish community they were called gola, after 48, you somehow have to represent the transformation. And it's very interesting what is happening in terms of the symbolic terminology. The term tfutzot, which I would translate to diaspora, starts to replace gola. Because what it signifies is it not only the state of Israel has been founded that can provide citizenship to the Jews who live in Israel itself. It also, by that very act, the land of the Jews in Israel, or the Jewish state, is also transforming the status of Jews who actually remain abroad. By calling them now diaspora, it's always in relation to Israel, and it actually highlights the fact that it's different than galut. Now, practically, it made no difference for the Jews who continued to live outside of Israel. I mean, there is direct continuity there. But if you continue to call them galut, it emphasizes that there is no change in the situation. So by applying a new term, you kind of reinforce 1948 as a transition. Now, it's interesting to see in terms of, and I'm moving on, in terms of the attitude to the exile. During the World War II, of course, the Yishuv expresses concern about the Holocaust and sends messengers, and sometimes, in some cases, to try to help if there is a possibility. But the Yishuv, or the Jewish Society of Palestine, was also very preoccupied with its own position, especially, when the Germans were proceeding in North Africa, and there was a fear that they would get to Egypt, and that they might move on to Palestine. What we see there is a kind of discrepancy between the older generation, the people who actually came from exile and were deeply concerned with the families that they left, and often expressing also guilt over leaving the families behind, and the Hebrew youth who got so much the repudiation of exile in their education that even though they also identified with Jews and expressed some concern, they also expressed the view, and I have to say, it's not easy to say it because you kind of feel difficulty to express it, but that's part of what has happened, and we do need to talk about that. There were Hebrew youth who actually felt that the Jews who remained in exile were the ones who did not really see the Zionist vision as the act that one needs to follow, and that in some ways they have behaved in a passive way, and they continue to behave like exilic Jews. And the phrase that they went like sheep to the slaughter was part of the phrases that the Hebrew youth were discussing as problematic to them, and interfering with their ability to emotionally identify with the Holocaust survivors. And so what we see in the 1950s, after Israel is founded, there is a slow process of it's not coming into terms, but trying to create a formal or an official commemorative framework to address the Holocaust. And because Israel went through a war, and because of the amount of refugees or new immigrants that it had to accommodate, I mean, there were other things that were coming into the picture, and I can't really expand on that. But also because there was some issues in how to address such a enormous event as the Holocaust. What would be the appropriate commemoration? And it's directly relevant to our issue about the perception of exile, because we see a real discrepancy between the secular Israelis and the Orthodox community. For the Orthodox community, there is not so much of a problem how to deal with it. You deal with the victims of the Holocaust as people who are martyrs, people who died on the sanctification of God's name, Kiddush Hashem, and there is a traditional frame of reference to deal with this issue. It's just part of it. And in terms of commemoration, there are traditional days of commemoration to commemorate disasters that befall on the Jewish community. For the state, and of course the predominantly secular Israelis who are in power, this is much more problematic. You cannot collapse the date of the Holocaust, the remembrance of the Holocaust, with another date. You have to make a distinct date. And the choice eventually on the day that is connected to the uprising of the Warsaw Ghetto is very symbolic of the lack of the ambivalence toward the Holocaust and the sense that it's easier to focus on the heroic act of the uprising that gives a sense of national pride in those people who rebelled against the Nazis, to make it the focal point of an event that actually within it, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is actually a small event, not in terms of the symbolism, but in terms of the impact of the amount of the scope of destruction and death that the Holocaust inflicted. Moreover, the name of the day, of the Holocaust Remembrance Day, is the Martyrs and Heroes Remembrance Days, and afterwards is heroism and the Holocaust. And the question is, from today's perspective, why is this dual focus? Why it's not just the Holocaust, which is today, Yom HaShoah, is just the Holocaust. But at that point, there was a need to also emphasize that there were heroic acts within it in order to create a more positive connotations for the identification with the Jews, and that's very typical of the 50s and the 60s in Israel. Now, there were other commemorations of the Holocaust that are operating in other levels. For example, there are memorial forests that are created in Israel on the names of different communities, and people give money for that. There are street names of different cities, have actually street names that are named on the name of a particular community that was destroyed in the Holocaust. Tel Aviv has it. We just mentioned with Joel Migdal, Hadar Yosef has a whole complex of streets named on that and so on. There were monuments that were created in the cemeteries. There were monuments that were created in urban spaces. What is interesting, though, that many of these monuments, whether forests or official monuments, were built with money that was donated by Jews, either from the States or from Europe or from Latin America, from other places. And in some ways, then, this act has more layers, as multi-layered in terms of a commemoration, because it commemorates the communities and it commemorates the Holocaust, but it's also a site of memory that affirms Israel's position as the custodian of national memory for the whole Jewish people. Because otherwise, why Jews from outside give the money to commemorate the Holocaust in Israel? There were also voluntary immigrants associations, or what is called in Yiddish, Landsmannschaften, that are created in Israel, as they were created also here and in Europe. And there you see actually the role of a community of memory. They are getting together, they are establishing this association in order to create a symbolic continuity between the past that was left behind, the community that was destroyed, and their contemporary lives in Israel. What is interesting is that this is a subculture that for the veteran Israelis, for the mainstream Israeli society, it's like marginalized. It's really not in the limelight, and people may not necessarily even know about it, but it's a very important network and a very important commemorative tradition that is created within these networks of the Landsmannschaften. And they serve as a living memorial, but also as a symbolic replacement for the community that is left behind. Similarly, there are synagogues that are based on actually ethnic affiliation or the place of origin. It can either be based on a city, like the Jews of Aleppo, or it could be, an Iraqi synagogue, or it could be of other communities. So that was another form, not necessarily about the Holocaust, but the connection to exile. Now, a really interesting case of another form of bridge between exile and contemporary life in Israel that is explicitly exilic, because as I said, there were other things in the culture that, that we can say are also symbolic bridges that have continuity from exile. If you want, all the calendar, the holidays that were celebrated in exile, they're celebrated here. So there's continuity in that, the continuity in the Jewish religion. But where the exile is right there in front, like in the Landsmannschaften, in the synagogues that are called by the place of origin. And these are the Haredi communities, which I have to use in terms of if people don't know what Haredi means. These are the Orthodox communities that do not accept the modernism of orthodoxy, or sometimes are called ultra-Orthodox. So these communities, either survivors of Hasidic courts or Lithuanian yeshivot, regroup in Israel around the rabbis, the rebbes that were actually able to leave the Europe and smuggled out, very often with the help of the Sochnut, of the Jewish Agency, or other Jewish organizations. Some of them come to the States, some of them come to Israel. What is interesting, and of course in Europe after the war, there are also such communities. What is interesting is that they keep their definition, their identity, based on the geographical location where they had started, where they originated from. So you have the Belzer Hasidim that have become really big movement in Israel today, and even more so the Gerer Hasidim, that are really, and they start from clicking around their rebbes. Other Hasidim that or Haredim, join them that may have lost their spiritual leaders, and they are rehabilitating the community. What is important for our end is that they create like a virtual geographical map. I mean, it's like transplanting the exile, the map from exile, into this new geographical place. And because the Haredim are wearing different clothes, some of them are speaking Yiddish, they vary in terms of their attitude to the state of Israel. Some of them are anti-Zionist, they continue to speak Yiddish, and they do not recognize or do not want to be part of the political life. Some of them join the political life, but they are obviously representing life, exilic life, that Zionism had rebelled against right there, visibly, in their enclaves, in their communities. Now, I want to move on, and I will get back to the Haredim and to religion later, but I want to move on just to go on in terms of the mainstream Israeli society and the attitude towards exile. I had already said that, of course, the Six-Day War was a really watershed politically, but in terms of our topic, in terms of memory, and in terms of the attitude towards exile, in fact, the Yom Kippur War of 1973 was much more detrimental, because that really reshaped both the commemorative map in Israel, or the commemorative landscape, the memory, but also the political map of Israel in the aftermath of the war. What happened during the war, that Israelis for the first time felt the vulnerability of their own situation and the kind of existential anxiety that it was not clear whether Israel is going to make it through the war or not. To the extent, yes, there was also worry before the Six-Day War. It's not the end. Of course, during the 1948-49 war also there was anxiety. It's not that it was immune from it, but the extent of this fear, probably because it came after the national euphoria of 67 and the sense that everything is safe. And then this downfall of a war that Israel was totally unprepared for, and the beginning of the war with so many casualties and a sense that, Israel is attacked on both sides and we don't know what is going on and what is going to happen there. The impact of this is enormous because from that point on, we start seeing the Holocaust becoming a major a historical event that is not just part of history, is not just part of an official memory and talking about 6 million Jews, but in fact an event that Israelis start to look at from their own psyche, collective psyche, from their own emotional state, and start to own it. This is not the event that happened to Jews in Europe or to exilic Jews. This is something that is part of our own collective memory. Now, it doesn't happen immediately. What you start seeing is actually the reference to the Holocaust, the reference to the Holocaust as a kind of a metaphor for the position of Israel. But as we progress through the 70s and the 80s, and then with the change of government, Bygone was very instrumental also to bringing the Holocaust and making it a political metaphor. The analogies between Israel and the Jews of exile, all of a sudden, it's not one against the other. It's not two oppositional experiences. It's collapsed into one historical continuity. And you know what? I could have given you a whole lecture just about this topic, and I can say even more. I could have taught a whole course just over, going over poetry, literature, theater, film, political speeches, a Remembrance Day ceremonies, going to Europe, a whole course, really. I mean, it occurred to me as I was writing these lectures that actually I probably should teach a course like that, and I would fill up. We have 14 weeks, not 10 weeks like you guys. I could have filled, probably the 14 weeks and still have to choose materials. So that's just to give you a sense. There is a book, actually, that I just want to mention, a novel by a relatively younger generation of Israeli writer, Amir Gutfreund, who wrote Our Holocaust, HaShoah Shelanu, and I think it has been translated to English, so it is available to read. And just think about the title, Our Holocaust. This is a second generation talking about the Holocaust, and in some way it really articulates what I would like to emphasize, the dramatic rise in identification with the Holocaust, which is a tremendous development from the 50s. Okay, now I want to address another realm of change, and that has to do with the ethnic traditions. I mentioned before the pressure that was put on new immigrants to relinquish the past, relinquish the memory of the tradition that they had at home, to not to speak the foreign language, to become part and parcel of the secular national Hebrew culture. And I'm sure that many of you know that this pressure was put on everyone. So Holocaust survivors felt the pressure the same as people who came from Syria or from Iraq or from Egypt. But it is because what we have in Northern Africa, what we have is a really enormous immigration, mass immigration of people who come from Muslim countries, either in the Middle East or Northern Africa. What has remained really in Israeli culture is the tremendous pressure that was put on this immigration by the Ashkenazi establishment, the socialist Zionists, who did not appreciate and did not understand what is the meaning of the ethnic traditions, and put the pressure, kind of expected the new immigrants to feel exactly like them, that they should leave the past behind, which is not what they wanted to do. What we see during the immigration comes, it's, starts after the war. So we have the 50s, we have through the 60s from Northern Africa. Of course, people do not, it's not a totalitarian regime. So yes, there is a pressure about the public space, it's marginalized. But of course, in the local venues, in the many of these immigrants are shipped to the periphery. There is a wonderful book that I love the title, Reluctant Pioneers, by Harvey Goldberg. Yes, that's exactly it. They were made pioneers in the periphery of the country. Of course, in their small settlements, they kept some traditions. But the pressure was really working its own, and it seemed that many of these traditions seemed to disappear. What we see in the 70s is that we have the second generation growing up. We have the new immigrants are relatively more established. And with the political transformation, with the Likud coming into government and with the crisis in the secular national mainstream Israeli society, all these things come into play, and I'm really giving you the kind of a shorthand because I can't really go into depth about it. But what we see is that these ethnic traditions that had been played down, if not suppressed, and kept in the local community, family context, all of a sudden start to move on to the public sphere. And what I would like now to do is to kind of give you a mosaic of how the attitude towards exilic tradition and exilic culture is transformed in a profound way in Israeli society from the late 60s on, and how it plays out in different domains. Now, I had to select, so there are other things that I did not mention, and we'll see how much I can cover, but I will not go into depth because my choice is rather to give you just examples of the different things that have happened. So what we see is in the domain of music. Middle Eastern music is not considered respectable music, right? It's Arabic music, it's Middle Eastern. Israel is in war with the Arabs. This is not part of the Ashkenazi, the European tradition. And I'm not talking only about classical music, I'm talking about the Israeli songs that are more European. So the Middle Eastern musicians do not really get a public forum to play their music, and what they develop is, except for the Arabic-speaking language that Kol Israel, the Voice of Israel, broadcasts as propaganda to Arabs. And the Iraqi Jewish musicians, which are the creme de la creme of the Middle Eastern music, are playing as the orchestra of Kol Israel, of the radio, Israeli National Radio, for the Arabs. But they don't have public forums. They play in local venues, and it's only recently that actually studies about that have come. But it's not like they stop playing. They just find their alternative places. Israel moves on to have, in the 70s, there are 69, 70. This is an era where festivals, music festivals are formed. And it's very interesting what is formed. There is a folk song, the Israeli Song Festival, Festival HaZemer HaYisraeli, which is the general, right? I mean, everything is there. But There are also the a Hasidic Song Festival, which is a private initiative because it is working. It's, it has its followers in the States and in Europe. So someone decides, and Shlomo Karlibach is very popular in Israel, and he is instrumental in doing it. And the other distinct festival is the Oriental Song Festival. That is how it's translated. Oriental means really Middle Eastern Song Festival. Why? Because they are not allowed to participate in the Israeli Song Festival, in the general one. So a kind of compensation, there is a different niche made for them. They are the folklore, they are the esoteric, they are the cultural heritage, they are not part of Israeli society. Because for Israelis, Israeli songs are the part of the mainstream. It's the Israel, it's the now there. Those guys who play Middle Eastern music, they are part of exile. They are continuing the exilic tradition, and so they are exiled to another festival. Now, what is happening is that the music is operating at the level of the neighborhood, at the level of the community, and more so, it is starting to sell not through official records, because no respectable recording company is interested in investing in that, but through cassettes. This is where cassettes start in the 80s. Cassettes start to become an alternative market, and which is a tool politically, as we know also, the cassettes, for underground speeches and whatever, but it's also an underground tool for underground music. And eventually, through the cassettes, they start to penetrate into mainstream. And by 1985, the Oriental Folk Song Festival is canceled. There is no need for it. It doesn't really have a stand because it's becoming more established. This was a big thing politically in the memory of Middle Eastern Jews and Middle Eastern singers. Now, in 1970, as part of this interest in the traditions, like the Hasidic songs and other things, there is a new development at the domain of museums. The Diaspora Museum, otherwise called Bet HaTfutzot, is built near the campus, or on the campus of Tel Aviv University, and its name provides exactly what I spoke about before. It's not the museum of the Galut or the Gola, the communities. It is Bet HaTfutzot. It recognizes the plurality of a Jewish experience during exile. Now, we can say this is a credit that here there is a museum like that is now built in Israel. However, when you look at who is the initiator of this museum, you discover that this is Nahum Goldman, who was not an Israeli, but the president of the World Jewish Congress. And he took 20 years from the time that he raises the idea until actually the museum is built. And when it's built, Nahum Goldman's goal was to reintroduce the respect to the Gola, the respect to the world Jewry in Israel. But there are a lot of arguments about it in the process of constructing the museum, and eventually it does show the plurality of Jewish exile experience, but the museum goes up to 48. So it still doesn't recognize that there is diaspora, after 48, which undermines actually the initial goal. More interesting than that, because that's a kind of an official memory level, is the emergence after that of small and specialized museums that different ethnic communities in Israel get organized to create the museums to preserve their cultural heritage, both to present it to others, but also for their own children, to maintain the tradition of their exilic past and transition to Israel. So I think the biggest, is probably the most established, is the museum for how do they call it? The Museum and Cultural Center of Babylonian Jewry in Or Yehuda, near Tel Aviv. But there are, quite a few others. There are the Jews of Libya, also in Or Yehuda. German Jews even created. That's really something. When German Jews create a museum, you know that, this is really in fashion. They were the last ones. Yemeni Jews, Kuchin Jews, Ethiopian Jews, Georgia, Hungary, Austria, Lithuania. And there is a center for Yiddish culture, Bet Shalom Aleichem, that opened in Jerusalem. Tel Aviv University also has a Yiddish center. These centers, they are between museums and community centers. They have exhibits about the past, depends on how well provided they are and the resources, but the ones that are larger have exhibits about the past that include the past of the community in exile, Zionist activities in exile, which is the kind of, a kind of a hechsher, that's the stamp of kashrut, that they are okay, that they were Zionist in exile, and also their contribution to the society in Israel. There is another activity that is revived, which is again fascinating, and could be a topic in itself for sure, and relatively little studied. It's amazing how many things in Israeli culture have not been studied really in depth. The revival of communal celebrations. So I'm talking about the Mimuna. I don't know how many, anybody knows here about the Mimuna? Okay, the Mimuna is the North African, mostly Moroccan holiday that begins at the very end of Passover. It starts in the evening because, according to the Jewish calendar, so the holiday started at the beginning was a religious ceremony, and then on the next day they were going out to nature and usually near water sources. The Mimuna almost disappeared in Israel in the 60s, immediately after the immigration. But then you start following, and actually just about a month ago, finally a book came out, which I asked to ship it to me quickly so I can read it, a book about the Mimuna. It's the first book that is really a scholarly analysis by Rachel Sharabi about the history of the Mimuna. So the first appearance of the Mimuna is 1966, very local, and is a politician actually that organizes it. What is interesting, I really don't have the time to tell you more about it, although it's a fascinating process. It begins in the periphery. It moves from the periphery to the center. It's becoming so important once it starts to be recognized that politicians, Israeli politicians, have to come and participate in the Mimuna in order to get the votes. And also it happened that it's very often it's close to elections. So much so that people afterwards complain that the political issues kind of overtake the community celebration. And then it moves back from the community to the periphery, and it starts being celebrated in a very visible way all over Israel, and the politicians go and, that's really when you know that they really need the votes. They go from the center to the periphery, to these immigrant towns. They make their own pilgrimage to be shown that they are going to all these remote places on the frontier to celebrate that. There are other holidays that I want to mention. I want to mention another custom, which is, again, very interesting. Actually, there has been recently terrific studies about that. And this is the re-emergence of the custom of pilgrimage to graves of tzaddikim, or pious men, rabbis, or pious scholar men who become known as having spiritual powers. And now they become known very often after their death, and that's by going to the grave. And you go to the grave on the day of this famous person, this tzaddik, righteous person, died, and there is the belief that this is going to help you. Now, when I said that this is revived, it's not totally accurate. And let me say, pilgrimage to graves is a custom that has been going on in the Middle East, but also in Europe and in North Africa. But it was maintained during the pre-state period and in the 50s and the 60s only by Orthodox Jews who were part of that. Not every Orthodox, also it depends, how much you are into it, and not modern Orthodox are not usually participating with that, but it really depends, and I'm also not an expert on that, so I would not elaborate where I'm not totally sure about that. But what I can tell you is that with the immigration of North African Jews, the North African Jews had a particularly important tradition of going to pray and to make hilulot, the celebrations, at the graves of the tzaddikim. There is an Israeli, actually a late Israeli scholar, Issachar Ben Ami, a folklorist, who went in the 80s to Morocco, and he counted that the Moroccan Jews had 652 graves of tzaddikim. So these guys left Morocco with a huge reservoir of graves that they could go to in order, and there were specialized things, there were different days and specialized requests, and they came to Israel, and lo and behold, there are some ancient rabbis, from the Mishnah, from the Talmud, the Talmudic period that they could go to, but it's still not replacing such a rich tradition that they had. Also, they were in no position to really travel when they were just coming to Israel and were really poor and much more restricted. What we see are strategies, commemorative strategies that are really fascinating. And here, it's really my work. What I'm saying is based on the work on the anthropologist, a great anthropologist, Yoram Bilu, who studied and published on the pilgrimage. Others did some work on it too, but he's really the leading scholar. One device to compensate for this gap is to create new tzaddikim. So there is a rabbi of the Tunisian community that dies in 1957 in Be'er Sheva, and this is actually a work by Alex Weingroth, another anthropologist, and they create in 1957. This is the first one that I found, the site of a new tzaddik that is formed in Israel, and it starts small, and within a few years it really turns into a huge pilgrimage into the cemetery of Be'er Sheva. I mean, there isn't even the space to accommodate it. And then there is a very famous rabbi from Morocco, Baba Sali, who dies in Netivot. It's an immigrant town in the Negev, and it becomes a whole industry of pilgrimage to Netivot, a whole memorial custom, and it's become very strong. So that is another form. I'm heading to the end, and I'll just mention very briefly, so 5 more minutes, is it okay? Okay. Another form of creating a pilgrimage to the tzaddikim is through dreams. Moroccan Jews have a tradition of dreaming, that you get messages through dreams, and rabbis whose graves are left in Morocco appear in the dreams of Moroccans in Israel and ask them to create a site, a memorial site for them. It's without the bones, but they create memorial, and this memorial site could be in an apartment, in one of those shikunim apartment, residential. But the community accepts it, and it becomes a site of pilgrimage, and it can become a huge thing. So there is a documentation of that too. Now, the last thing that I will finish with now, and believe me, I've skipped a lot, but I cannot not tell you about that there is an idea of creating a Shtetl park in Israel. And it sounds like a joke, but it really is. It's an idea that was promoted, and actually there was already been the breaking the ground ceremony has already been performed. And creating a Shtetl park, and it's going to be in Rishon LeZion, which is really interesting because that's supposed to be the first moshava of the first aliyah, although Petach Tikva actually has a better claim to be the first, but it's and so it's in the heart of the Zionists' resettlement of the land of Israel. There is, and it's a combination of a living history museum with actors who would perform. It's a replica of a shtetl. Professor Yael is actually the person behind this initiative, and I don't know where it stands. What is Israel? I mean, I have to actually, when I go to Israel, I will check at what point it is. But in 2003, the groundbreaking ceremony was already done. It's a very expensive enterprise, though. What is interesting is that I came across an Israeli novel where the same theme appears in this novel. And the novel is called What You Wished For, Ma Sheratzitem, by Egor Schiff. It's not a very well-known writer. And the story there is about a filmmaker who is looking for new ideas. He's kind of dried up and he's looking for ideas, and he goes to a used bookstore and he finds a folder with old photographs and some notes and whatever, and it's called the Zhilonitz Kameletria. Zhilonitz becomes alive. So Zhilonitz is this, fabricated name or fictional name of the town, and he decides that he's going to create a theme park. He's going to actually use it as a model, the pictures and the notes, to create this park of the Shtetl. Now the book has a twist. Where is he going to build this Shtetl park? He's going to build it in the West Bank, because that's where he can find the land. And then, in order to justify why he needs to do it there, someone gives him the idea that he can give unemployed Palestinians the task of being the actors who will perform the survivor, the Holocaust, the Shtetl people. And he actually looks and he persuades him, it's exactly the same. They really look like them. So that's where it is. Well, finally, it's not approved. Finally, there's a suicide bomb. He's dead. And the end of the story is that actually 2 Americans are interested in buying the rights to recreate the Shtetl, and they're going to do it in Florida, which is, of course, a twist, because then it will be, they will have Disney World, will have the biblical Christian park, and then there will be the Shtetl, so the Shtetl is exiled again. But what about the real Shtetl park? We'll have to see. So I'll stop here.